Some Terms of Thought in Modern Philosophy. Essay number 4. A Long Way Round to Nirvana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Some Terms of Thought in Modern Philosophy. 5 essays by George Santayana. Essay number 4. A Long Way Round to Nirvana. Development of a suggestion found in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle. That the end of life is death may be called a truism, since the various kinds of immortality that might perhaps supervene would none of them abolish death, but at best would weave life and death together into the texture of a more comprehensive density. The end of one life might be the beginning of another. If the Creator had composed his great work like a dramatic poet, assigning successive lines to different characters, death would then be merely the cue at the end of each speech, summoning the next personage to break in and keep the ball rolling. Or perhaps, as some suppose, all the characters are assumed in turn by a single supernatural spirit, who amid his endless improvisations is imagining himself living for the moment in this particular solar and social system. Death in such a universal monologue would be but a change of scene or of meter, while in the scramble of a real comedy it would be a change of actors. In either case, every voice would be silenced sooner or later, and death would end each particular life in spite of all possible sequels. The relapse of created things into nothing is no violent fatality, but something naturally quite smooth and proper. This has been set forth recently in a novel way by a philosopher from whom we hardly expected such a lesson, namely Professor Sigmund Freud. He has now broadened his conception of sexual craving, or libido, into a general principle of attraction or concretion in matter, like the eros of the ancient poets Hesiod and Empedocles. The windows of that stuffy clinic have been thrown open, that smell of acrid disinfectants, those hysterical shrieks, have escaped into the cold night. The troubles of the sick soul, we are given to understand, as well as their cure, after all, flow from the stars. I am glad that Freud has resisted the tendency to represent this principle of love as the only principle in nature. Unity somehow exercises an evil spell over metaphysicians. It is admitted that in real life it is not well for one to be alone, and I think pure unity is no less barren and graceless in metaphysics. You must have plurality to start with, or trinity, or at least duality, if you wish to get anywhere, even if you wish to get effectively into the bosom of the One, abandoning your separate existence. Freud, like Empedocles, has prudently introduced a prior principle for love to play with, not strife, however, which is only an incident in love, but inertia, or the tendency towards peace and death. Let us suppose that matter was originally dead and perfectly content to be so, and that it still relapses, when it can, into its old equilibrium. But the homogeneous, as Spencer would say, when it is finite, is unstable, and matter, presumably not being coextensive with space, necessarily forms aggregates which have an inside and an outside. The parts of such bodies are accordingly differently exposed to external influences, and are differently related to one another. This inequality, even in what seems most quiescent, is big with changes, destined to produce in time a wonderful complexity. It is the source of all uneasiness of life and love. Let us imagine, writes Freud, in an undifferentiated vesicle of sensitive substance, then its surface, exposed as it is to the outer world, is by its very position differentiated, and serves as an organ for receiving stimuli. This morsel of living substance floats about in an outer world which is charged with the most potent energies, and it would be destroyed if it were not furnished with protection against stimulation. On the other hand, the sensitive cortical layer has no protective barrier against excitations emanating from within. The most prolific sources of such excitations are the so-called instincts of the organism. The child never gets tired of demanding the repetition of a game. He always wants to hear the same story instead of a new one, insists inexorably on exact repetition, and corrects each deviation which the narrator lets slip by mistake. According to this, an instinct would be a tendency in a living organic matter, impelling it towards reinstatement of an earlier condition, one which it had abandoned under the influence of external disturbing forces, a kind of organic elasticity, or, to put it another way, the manifestation of inertia in organic life. If then all organic instincts are conservative, historically acquired, and directed toward regression, towards reinstatement of something earlier, we are obliged to place all the results of organic development to the credit of external, disturbing, and distracting influences. The rudimentary creature, from which its very beginning not have wanted to change, would, if circumstances had remained the same, have always merely repeated the same course of existence. It would be counter to the conservative nature of instinct if the goal of life were a state never hitherto reached. It must be rather an ancient starting point, which the living being left long ago, and to which it harks back again by all the circuitous paths of the development. The goal of life is death. Through a long period of time the living substance may have had death within easy reach, until decisive external influences altered in such a way as to compel it to ever greater deviations from the original path, and to ever more complicated and circuitous routes to the attainment of the goal of death. These circuitous ways of death, faithfully retained by the conservative instincts, would be neither more nor less than the phenomena of life as we know it." End quote. Freud puts forth these interesting suggestions with much modesty, admitting that they are vague and uncertain and, what is even more important to notice, mythical in their terms. But it seems to me that, for all that, they are admirable counterblast to prevalent follies. When we hear that there is, animating the whole universe, an élan vital, or general impulse toward some unknown but single ideal, the terms used are no less uncertain, mythical, and vague. But the suggestion conveyed is false. False, I mean, to the organic source of life and aspiration, to the simple naturalness of nature, whereas the suggestion conveyed by Freud's speculation is true. In what sense can myths and metaphors be true or false? In what sense that, in terms drawn from moral predicaments or from literary psychology, they may report the general movement and the permanent issue of material facts, and may inspire us with a wise sentiment in their presence. In this sense, I should say that Greek mythology was true, and Calvinist theology was false. The chief terms employed by a psychoanalyst have always been metaphorical: unconscious wishes, the pleasure principle, the Oedipus complex, narcissism, the censor. Nevertheless, interesting and profound vistas may be opened up in such terms to the tangle of events in a man's life, and a fresh start may be made with fewer encumbrances and less morbid inhibition. The shortcomings of our description, Freud said, would probably disappear if for psychological terms we could substitute physiological or chemical ones. These too only constitute a metaphorical language, but one familiar to us for a much longer time, and perhaps also much simpler. All human discourse is metaphorical, in that our perceptions and thoughts are adventitious signs for their